Berkeley at that point had hired J. Desmond Clark, who was one of the premier African archaeologists, and they were in the process of wooing Glenn Isaac, who was another one of the premier archaeologists for African archaeology. So I applied there, and the way Berkeley ran back then, I don't know about now, is that they would not consider you for a scholarship until you had completed 1 year. So you had to come on your own hook for 1 year, which I did, and I discovered to my delight, that what happened when you went in and registered as a graduate student is that they looked at your transcript, and if you had more than a 3.5 average, they waived tuition. Okay, and they continued waiving tuition like that during your first year. And at the beginning of the second year, I got an NDEA fellowship, National Education Defense Act fellowship, which carried me through the rest of the graduate program at Berkeley. And so I got my master's at Berkeley and my PhD at Berkeley. It was on, obviously, in terms of field work and so forth, it was East African material. Your master's, they give you pretty much, well, you have to apply for it, but it's automatic after you, at that time it was after you had done your orals and passed them, and then they gave you your master's. Remember, this was during the Vietnam War, so they were having graduate students being plucked out and in the middle of their things, so they would hurry them through orals so that they had a master's degree when they went into the military, and this was likely to keep them off the front battle lines in many cases when they did this. If you had an NDEA, you were no longer eligible for the draft, so that also protected me from the draft. In the master, in the orals, I defended cultural ecology, culture change, and African prehistory. So I had Anderson, who was the ecologist, on the thing. I had Hay for geology. I had Kenneth Bach on the committee, who was a sociologist who was actually, in terms of historiography, he was a student of Tegart, who had a very different approach to history, to doing history, than the major schools of historiography, and so different that all of his students ended up in sociology and anthropology departments. And so Hodgin was his student, and then Bach was Hodgin's student. So those are the three fields that I defended. And then in terms of actual dissertation work, it was the later Stone Age in Kenya and Uganda that I did, 27 occurrences. I got involved even before orals in 1967. I went over to Uganda to work for Marek Poznański, who was the director of the African Studies program at Makerere University at that time. He was an Iron Age archaeologist, and among the sites that he had excavated was Nsongezi Rock Shelter, which had a Iron Age component at the top, and Magozi II Rock Shelter, which had some Pastoral Neolithic material at the top of it, and also a third site, Nero Rock Shelter. Nero rock shelter he excavated because of all the rock paintings. Magosi 2 he excavated because of Magosi 1, which was supposed to be this site that was right in between the Middle Stone Age and the Later Stone Age, with kind of a, I guess you'd call it a house and sport-like industry. And so the idea was the second rock shelter at Magosi might yield the same assemblage, which would be very important if it could be dated or anything. And so he worked at that side. So he didn't work with stone tools, so I was brought in to do the stone tools from those 3 sites. And those were all later Stone Age assemblages, and so that sort of formed the nucleus, the beginning point for my dissertation. And then I went on to work with Glenn Isaac, in his Naivasha-Nakuru Basin project, again working on later Stone Age materials. You sort of get buried over in Africa, the Rift Valley. Well, when I finished up when I was ABD at Berkeley, I went on the job market. I initially had and accepted a job offer from Yale, and then the person who hired me from Yale came back a month or so later and said, "I'm sorry, we can't hire you this year." He was extremely apologetic. Somehow the position had evaporated. And so I started looking around, and I had very good prospects for interviewing at City University of New York. Were quite interested in me. And the University of Massachusetts at Boston was interested in me, and a couple of other places. And the first place I interviewed at was the University of Massachusetts at Boston, and they gave me a job offer within a week, and so I took that. And that was a department that was literally just forming. It was, when I joined it, it was still part of the sociology department, and a year or so later, we formed our own separate department. So it was a chance of building things from scratch, and they were in the process of building a campus for it. It didn't have a campus. It was initially in downtown Boston. It didn't have a campus, but they were building one. And so I was told I had to design the labs. So I designed what I thought were extremely elaborate and expensive labs, and I turned in this budget for, I don't know, $200,000 or something, or $250,000 for these labs to equip them. This was just the equipment budget, mind you. And they just say, "Oh, this looks good." And I thought to myself, my God, I should have asked for $500,000. So we had very fine labs, teaching labs and research labs both. Whilst in Uganda working for America, I essentially was on the campus. I had a tutor's flat at North Hall, you see, and ate at high table there. This was the old English system, so you ate at high table. And well, there is an amusing story here when I first came to Uganda. So you had to fly. I had a travel grant, NSF travel grant, to go over there and come back. And you had to use a U.S. carrier, which meant either American Airlines or TWA at the time. And so they didn't fly through Europe. They flew through West Africa. So you started out sometime during the day in the United States, and then by the time you got over to West Africa, it was like 11 or 12 at night, and then you made like 3 or 4 stops in West Africa at all these various countries, and you were not allowed to get off the plane. So you were sitting while they, redid the plane, you had to sit in the cabin, and of course it became very humid inside when this happened. And then you got to spend another 8 hours or so in the air, to get to Uganda. And so you arrive at the end of the next day, about 6 o'clock, and of course the sun sets at 7 when you're on the equator all year round. And so Marek Poznansky meets me at the airport. And he says, "Well, I hope you don't mind terribly, but I'm supposed to give a talk at the Uganda Society this evening. Would you mind coming along with me, as I'm rather short on time?" And I said, "No, that's fine." I was sort of half asleep anyway. And so we get, this was being held at the National Museum, and they had a nice little place where you could give talks, which was it was sort of senior common roomish type thing. All mahogany paneling and ceiling fans, and there's a little guy in the corner doing this, making the ceiling fan go. I looked at this and I said, "Oh, I'm not in Kansas anymore." So that was my introduction to Uganda. Anyway, I had a little lab, actually in a separate little attached building, about a third of the size of this room, where I was working on all this, on the stuff that he collected, sorting it, typing it, measuring it, etc., and doing all the necessary things you have to do to prepare, descriptive report. And in the meanwhile, I'm living at Northcote Hall with High Table, and at High Table you actually attend High Table wearing academic robes. So I had to go and check out academic gowns from the academic gown department on the campus. And so there were like 7 of us at High Table. One of the people who was normally on High Table with me was the head of the philosophy department at one of the Jesuit schools in the eastern United States, who had been seconded by the Vatican and sent to Uganda in order to be the confessor to all the priests in Uganda. So his job was to confess the priests. And so he was in the philosophy department there, and what did he teach? He was a Jesuit, and he taught Marxism. And in the meantime, in the basement of the building, he made furniture to get rid of his frustrations. And I used to go around Uganda with him on weekends while he confessed priests. And everywhere he went to confess priests, I would go out and do a little surveying. And as a result, I found a number of archaeological sites this way, some of which ended up in my dissertation. So that's what I did. And then I came back, still analyzing material from Magozi, which was a very large collection. I had already done Nero and Kansior and Nsongezi completely. In 1969, I was part of Glenn Isaac's Naivasha Nakuru thing, and I had responsibility for the later Stone Age technologies. And as it turned out, these also included technologies associated with pastoralists. So I did my dissertation on that material, plus the material from Uganda, plus some museum collections in Nairobi. Notably, Naivasha Rock Shelter is probably the more important one, and Moringa Rock Shelter as well. So this was a big systematic typological analysis of later Stone Age horizons, generally from about 10,000 years ago to something like 2,000 years ago. And it was duly completed and accepted, and some results from this were published in a Pan-African Congress volume. I then came back to East Africa in a large project, heading a large project in the Central Rift, which was a year abroad teaching exercise to begin with, involving about a dozen U.S. students and 8 students from Kenya, 4 from the University of Nairobi and 4 from Kenyatta University College, as it was then called. And here the emphasis again was on both the later Stone Age and what came to be called the Pastoral Neolithic, which phrase I in fact invented. So I'm going to probably be most noted for 3 things as far as my African career is concerned. One is development of SACs, the systematic site enumeration system for Africa, and the second one being recognition and establishment of the term Pastoral Neolithic as a term of art describing an entire period in Eastern African prehistory, and the third being the companion term Pastoral Iron Age. So when I came back in 1975, 76, and worked pretty much continuously until something like 1981 or 82, I was working on a large survey project and excavations at numerous Pastoral Neolithic sites and later Stone Age sites, and also working out the actual geochronology at Nderet Rift, which records the rise and fall of the Naivasha-Nakuru lake basin system. And this was for the Nakuru half of the system after fall from the last high lake stand. And I did that in excruciating detail. So, and then I came back sort of periodically in the 80s, and then in 85 and 86, I was an instructor on the Kubifora Field School of Paleoanthropology, which is along Lake Turkana, and then again left for a time and came back in the when I came back into my Fulbright, I also spent a couple of summers working for the Kubifora Field School again that would be again in the mid-90s. And from that came a description of and this is the 4th thing I guess I might end up being noted for, if it survives, and that is a redefinition of Nderetware, a particular ceramic tradition in Eastern Africa associated with the earliest movement of pastoral peoples in East Africa from the Sudan and southern Ethiopia. Later in time, much later in time, so this was after I had worked in Kenya with my own projects and everything, and come back to the States, and I applied for and got a Fulbright to go back. This was actually a position that was sort of designed for me or someone very much like me to come and help design a graduate curriculum and redo the undergraduate curriculum in the history department, because that's where archaeology was housed, was inside of history. And so I did a 1 year's Fulbright, and then they needed, this was at a time when things were rather hot politically. No one would apply. They literally had no applications for Fulbrights for Kenya, or maybe only one or two. And so they asked me to stay on a second year if I would, and I did. And then I went on to local contract. I had some contracts, some students who had worked in the sort of the grain industry at grain depots as a means of making money when they were sort of in high school and college, first year of college. And they knew all about all the ways in which you could actually make money cheating the government at these grain silos. And so I interviewed them extensively and cross-correlated things and cross-correlated everything that was saying to me. And I was actually able to quantify quite exactly how much grain was being stolen at the input, at the elevators where they were actually taking the grain in. And I identified 40 different techniques, different processes by which money and grain were being stolen from the government. So efficiently, in fact, that they were actually stealing more than the value of the crop. There were various levels of who was getting the cut, and I defined these in terms of the hierarchy, and you just graph so you could predict what it was going to be when it got to the regional one, and then when it got to Nairobi, the big high mucky muck one, so you could just draw the graph up and show how much was being stolen. And I wrote all of this up and presented it to the embassy. And this was at a time when they were having their first elections since the death of Kenyatta, the first ones. And so this was a time at this is when Moi was president, Daniel Arap Moi, and this was one of the two issues that the donors, all the donor countries confronted with them, was the cereals board issue, my report, and then the postal system and all of the graft that went on in the customs collection through the postal system. My name was not on this report. It was officially called a non-paper. That was the official name for it at the embassy. But then they had a meeting of a regional AID, which was located south in sort of Central Africa. Well, they came up to Nairobi to have a meeting to which I was invited. And they also invited a Kenyan AID official. And I knew at that point that it would soon be known who had written that report. So I knew at that point my days were numbered in Nairobi. But I had one more go at this, and that is the Society of American Africanists, American Society of Africanists. They have two journals, and one of them is a journal of opinion, and which is a political, this is sort of their political position. They publish sort of politically hot things in that and circulate it. And they were doing one on education in Africa, and I was asked to do a piece on higher education, and I did it using the University of Nairobi as a template, and I produced a paper called PAT 101, Principles of Patronage. and it's all organized like a course proposal or a course outline, and it goes through all the principles of patronage and how these work, and of course what the effects are. So then I knew from experience in the senior common room that it would take about a year for this to penetrate the university. That is, they wouldn't really, even though they got the publication and everything, very few people would ever read it, and it would probably take a year before my little article was read. Said, okay, I've got a year to leave. And I used that year to wind things down and leave. That's how my work in Africa terminated, yes. One of the places I worked at is a place called Lucania Hill, about 30 kilometers east of Nairobi, along the Mombasa Road. And it's, I don't know, 2 or 3 or 4 miles long and 3/4 of a mile wide. It's a big Inselberg of granite gneiss. And it has, like all Inselberg, it has the typical alluvial apron that surrounds it, which then goes off into your flatter savanna, and the next mountain range or Inselberg over in between, there's a stream that comes down the middle there. And Lucania, I used that as a headquarters and as a teaching place for 2 or 3 years to teach students how to survey and excavate. And we found well over 200 sites on that hill. And if I could go back there, I'm sure I could find another 100 without too much difficulty. And these things ranged from things which were probably early Stone Age, all the way up to Maasai meat feasting sites from when the British held all the Maasai in the valley next to the Inselberg, while the rinderpest epidemic burned itself out in the Athi Kapiti Plain to the south and in the Serengeti in the 1890s. And so we had the whole thing there. And one of the things that had happened in the settlement of the hill is that people had put in little check dams to hold water from small areas of runoff during the rainy season for their stock. And from these little things, erosion gullies had developed going up in some cases all the way up to the base of the rock, which in some cases might be 800 to 1,000 meters. And there was more than one of these along here, and so the question was, in part, I was sort of just mildly interested in how they formed and everything. We found a site on the other side of the hill from the main, where our actual camp was, which had one of these things that was just starting to develop, and it was eating its way into a big pastoral Neolithic site. And then working in various areas, I came across one, for example, such gully that was perhaps 100 meters wide and 50 meters deep. And it's completely stable, no longer active at all, but it had been active at some time in the past. And in looking at the deposits along these, I suddenly realized that I now understood how the entire erosion cycle for Inselbergs all over arid Africa worked. All over the savanna worked. Not just at Lucania Hill, but any Inselberg you want to go to and name, I can tell you how erosion cycles work and how you can use this knowledge to find sites from Acheulean all the way up to modern. Okay, if you know where to look. And that's because the way in which carbonate layers develop in the ground, the way in which runoff comes off of the Inselberg, and much of it runs off the surface, but much of it runs straight down the side of the Inselberg, where the ground is porous and so forth, and it hits one of these carbonate layers, and it flows along the surface. And the carbonate layer is pitched at the level of the alluvial apron, so it just runs down the alluvial apron. But the thing is that the alluvial apron, all these things taper, and so at a certain critical distance from your Inselberg, which depends on the size of the Inselberg and the amount of rainfall you have in the area, if you go up on top of your Inselberg and you look around, you will see that there are patches of trees that stay green all year round through the dry season. Okay? And so you see a patch out there, it'll be a kilometer out from the base of the Inselberg, or something like that. And on the other side, there'll be another one here, and there'll be, those are the points the water is being delivered. If the water breaks the surface there, or if you dig to get to the water, it doesn't matter whether you're a Stone Age person or whether you're a cattle rancher today, you dig where you see this vegetation, and inside of 2 meters, less than 2 meters, you will find water flowing along the top of the carbonate layer. And as soon as you create an open face, having dug this hole, whether it's for a stock pond or just to get water during the dry season because you're thirsty, once you have done that, a process is started. And in this process, all the fine-grained material above, which is about the same as loess from our area here in terms of its fineness, all of that collapses along a vertical face, because what happens is right along the carbonate layer, it dissolves, and so it forms an undercut. And when that undercut gets to the point where the stuff is mechanically unstable above it, it just falls straight down, and then it's washed out, and this just progresses all the way up to the top. Okay, and eventually it's filled in, and so we actually found a valley that was filled in with old stuff in it like this. Okay, and this happens at different points around the Inselberg, and so as you go around the Inselberg, the surface, you dig, 2 feet under the surface or so, and it's a different age in different places. And you can tell by things like the weathering of various kinds of materials there. And so there are blocks, and in this block of sediment that is left, that has been left standing in between these various events, you're going to have right under the surface Middle Stone Age material, or early later Stone Age material, where it's going to all be past Neolithic material or later Stone Age material. And you can start mapping the surfaces around the Inselberg, and this tells you exactly where to prospect for sites of different kinds. And it's going to be the same anywhere you go. So that was another kind of an aha moment that I had, where you have suddenly the scope of how you can see things in the world, and the implications this has for your archaeology changes dramatically. Well, I would say Clark and Isaac, J. Desmond Clark and Glenn Isaac, will probably be the biggest influences. Well, those were two of my mentors. I guess you could say Doherty was a mentor here in the Northwest. I would say those three probably. Richard Leakey became a mentor, I think, as well later on. Yeah, there are. I greatly admired Mary Leakey. Uh, uh, she was a very good archaeologist, and she also managed to manage Louis Leakey, which didn't no easy thing to do. So I would certainly looked up to her, and I looked up tremendously to Glenn and Desmond. Both they were, you know, they had, for somewhat different reasons. Glenn had a tremendous intellect and ability to synthesize material, and Desmond had the ability to bring things together and bring all kinds of people together and get them to work with one another to get things done. And he was tremendously productive during his career for that reason. His syntheses and things were, workmanlike, but they weren't brilliant, I don't think. But just the sheer amount of material that he contributed and the number of things that he got working together. So he was, for example, the person who brought Francois Bourd and Don Crabtree together. And he had the ability to, make these kinds of connections and make things happen because of it. Oh, closest colleagues. Well, I would say John Bauer would be one. He's now deceased. He's one of the guys that I hired when I was doing the big project in East Africa. I hired him, and I hired Michael Gramley. But I was quite close with John Bauer, and Harry Merrick I've been very, very close with. Always, we were fellow graduate students. And he's the one who I told you earlier about the Yale thing, and then the following year they were in the hiring market again, and they hired him. And considering what happened to him at Yale and what he found out about how the Yale department was run, I'm glad that I missed that opportunity. That's why I did list it as a setback. Well, Stanley Ambrose would be one, who's quite a prominent archaeologist, now working in Africa mainly. And another person who had quite an interesting career was one of my African students, Henry Matoro, who's now Dean of Arts and Sciences at the University of Nairobi. So he's, gone up the ladder that way. He hasn't been tremendously productive as a scholar, but he has been as an administrator, and he's done a great deal of work that way. And then one of my other Kenyan students became a member of Parliament. So it was quite successful from that point of view. And of course, I've had students who've, gone on to academic positions in Kenya and positions in the national museums in Kenya. A number of the Kenyan students. In America, they've gone off. One became the other one that became really successful would be William McDonough, who one of the things we did was an obsidian source survey, and one of the things that I did was to sort of give him to the geologist in charge, which was a mistake because McDonough became a geologist, but he's a geophysicist who works on the interior of the Earth, And he has 150 published articles now. He's done very, very well. Max Planck Institute, University of Australia. He's been all around the world doing things and is still quite productive today. The wild game in Africa sometimes does give you pause. When we were the Kubi Four Field School, the way it works is that there's an insurance policy that is purchased for everybody. It's like a group policy for flying doctors, and on 2 occasions that I know of, people had to be evacuated by plane for snake bite, or highly poisonous snakes biting them. So that's one thing of excitement. And another one at Kubi 4, which was quite amusing, was when we were up on Kubi 4 Ridge, there was a laga that which is like an arroyo. It's a dry sand, very flat sand bed. Actually, in this part of the world, it would be lava, so basaltic sand mostly. And people used to sleep out on the laga at night. And we had cots, so we would sleep on cots and just put them out on the laga. And so one morning when we awoke and got up, there were lion tracks. And a group of lions had came right through the camp at night. And you would see their tracks going around the cots. So they were obviously checking us out all individually, And they did this and moved on, and nobody was the wiser. Nobody woke up. So there were little pieces of excitement like that